Welcome to the big idea about Of Mice and Men. So I'm going to try and show you all the themes in one video. We're going to start with the racism in the novel, and the first thing you need to know is that Steinbeck is against racism, and therefore Crooks is created in order to show the kind of racist treatment that black men had in 1930s America. Steinbeck is showing this treatment not because he agrees with it, but because he thinks it should change. And he skillfully interweaves this with the story of other sorts of prejudice to other characters, so that his readers, remember they're in 1930s America and very likely to be racist themselves, so that his readers will change their mind because they'll make the link between the way that Crooks is treated and see how this is also like the way Lenny is treated and Candy is treated and Curly's wife. It will probably help you to see some historical context, which I've stolen here, or rather I'm quoting it, from BBC website above, and it's about how black Americans were treated in America. And you can see here the first significant laws to be passed to try and address the inequality of black Americans came in 1941. And the book, you'll remember, is published in 1937. So Steinbeck is ahead of his time, but not far ahead. If you like, he's sensing a changing public mood about the treatment of black citizens in America, and President Roosevelt is going to pick up on this and begin to change things in the 1940s. He didn't change it earlier, even though he wanted to, because many of the racists in Southern America voted Democrat, and he's a Democratic president and needed their support. And so, like many Americans, he put up with the racism because it was convenient to do so, but also wanted to change it. He was biding his time, and authors like Steinbeck are testing that public mood and trying to get things changed. Hopefully you'll remember that Crooks is threatened with being lynched by Curly's wife, and she'll succeed in that simply by accusing him of having some kind of sexual relationship with her, or a rape. She doesn't spell this out because she doesn't need to. So here we have a lynching. It's in Florida, and it happened on the 19th of July 1935. So 2 years before the book is published. This would have been in the recent memory of Steinbeck's readers. And you'll see that the white mob took this black man from the deputies and murdered him. This is interesting because it shows how men of the time believed that they could get away with murder if they thought it was justified. And that's exactly what happens with the killing of Lenny. They shoot him in the assumption that the officers of the law will think this is reasonable given that he has killed Curly's wife. And they did not prosecute the murderer, even though there were photographs of the white mob who lynched this, innocent man. He hasn't been to trial. And then here you've got some proof about President Roosevelt not wanting to risk alienating his voters in 1936. So you can see at the time that the book is written, civil rights and racism were hot topics amongst Democratic voters and politicians. And Steinbeck is tapping into this because his book is about social change. He wants to change society. And these details come to you from Wikipedia. If we look at the historical context in slightly more detail, here's a reward, $12,500, an enormous amount. You'll remember in Of Mice and Men, they're getting paid $50 a month. So this is a huge amount of money. And it's for the killers of 4 Negroes, this was the politically correct way of saying black at the time. Now the politically correct way in America is to call black citizens African Americans. And it's not the police who are going to offer this reward, and there's an implication here that the police are themselves racist, and that's why it's the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who are investigating. So hopefully you can see that in 1937 this is a very live topic, racism, and 9 years later the problem is still there. Although Steinbeck creates Crooks to feel like a real character, he's also there as a device, and we can clearly see how much he's there to change his readers' view of racism when we look at his effect on the plot. We don't need crooks in the plot. The killing of Lenny would happen just the same. The killing of Curly's wife would happen just the same, and the Dream Ranch would not get realised just the same. So he's not needed for the plot at all. He's only there as a theme, an idea, and he is an attempt to change the idea of the readers. He's there to show racism at the time and to show that racism is the same as other sorts of discrimination, as I mentioned earlier in the video. And he's also there to show this idea of the effects of poverty. So circumstance will crush the individual. There is no rising above what society allows. And this is why Steinbeck makes Crooks highly intelligent. He's the only character with books, highly educated. He's the one who looks at the law in order to defend his rights, and symbolically is highly intelligent with his gold-rimmed spectacles, symbolising that kind of wisdom. All these things Steinbeck gives him in order to counterpoint, to dramatise how, no matter how advantaged he is as an individual, circumstance, in this case a racist society, will conspire against him. The next big theme is sexism, and obviously he explores this through Curly's wife and also the two madams who run brothels, Susie and Clara. Here's some historical background for you from peakoilblues.org. So in the 1937 census, exactly when this novel is written, 23% of white women were without work. So that's a fifth of women without work, and white men, 18%. Sorry, a quarter of women without work, what am I saying, and a fifth of men. So you can see that the situation for women was worse, especially if you were not married. The hardships that women faced, therefore, were worse than the hardships that men faced. This is an important point. Again, Curly's wife is supposed to feel like a real person, but she's also there as a symbol. So obviously she has no name in the novel, and Steinbeck does this in order to showcase how she's treated as a possession, not just by the men on the ranch, but also by extension society in general. So Steinbeck is suggesting that women are treated as the possessions of men. He shows her to be a victim of sexism. So she is called tart and a bitch, and it's suggested by George and Candy and many other men that she's in fact a prostitute, when actually nothing could be further from the truth. She never asks for sex from the men, nor does she offer it in exchange for money. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that she behaves in that kind of way. In fact, she's very different from all the other women who are prostitutes themselves, Clara and Susie. She is a victim of men, but even of the most innocent of men. So if you think about Lenny, he doesn't have any sexual interest in women because his mind is too young. he is in fact completely innocent, just like a young child. And it's significant that Steinbeck decides that it's the childlike man who's going to kill Curly's wife. So he's suggesting that all men are potentially dangerous to women, even the most innocent ones. And then finally, he shows the narrow choices available to women at the time if they're unmarried. So Curly's wife can't find a job. Yes, prostitution is available to her, but she has more pride than that and chooses to marry. Yes, she doesn't choose a very good match in Curly, in the sense that we don't like him and neither does she, but financially he's a very good bet. He's the boss's son. The farm seems prosperous, and so she's escaping poverty in the only way she knows how. The fact that she makes such a mess of it is Steinbeck's way of showing that the choices available to women are narrow. They're not very positive ones. She's just making the best of a very bad deal. The other discrimination is ageism here, and this is represented by Candy. Again, some historical facts might help you from Elderweb. So in 1935, 1/3 to 1/2 of the 7.5 million people aged 65 or older in the country, that is America, were dependent on either public assistance or relatives. In other words, they were not wealthy enough to look after themselves. That is a huge number, that 1/3 to 1/2. And Candy represents that. Yes, he's got savings, but unless he can use those to buy a ranch, a property, they'll be spent. And Lenny and George's dream ranch is the only way to spend that money to get something that he would be able to live off. They will literally live off the fat of the land. They'll grow their own food on the ranch. And once that dream disappears, we can see a bitter future for Candy, where he won't be able to look after himself. And you can see that society at the time was considering very ageist policies. So one idea was to retire older workers, still giving them some money, but to make their jobs available to younger people. Well, that's great if you're a young person, but if you're an older person, it seems rather extreme that your employment would be taken away from you. And that's exactly the future that Candy envisages for himself. We could see George's refusal to help him out at the end by buying the ranch with him as symbolic of how society has discarded the old. And there are so many of them, 7.5 million, but they're simply left to suffer because they're not treated as important as the young. And Steinbeck, in his portrayal of Candy, could be campaigning against this ageism in society. Again, Candy feels like a real person, but he is also a construct in order for Steinbeck to pursue his themes. One theme of the whole novel is that death is waiting for us all. There's no escaping from it. Curly's wife can't escape from this kind of destiny. George says, I guess I should have known, when Lenny kills her, and that death is awaiting Lenny from the outset of the novel. This is why George tells him to meet in the brush. He somehow has an instinctive understanding that this is where they're going to end up, and it's all going to end rather badly, probably with death, although we can't imagine that he envisaged having to kill Lenny himself. The other thing it shows is that decay is inevitable. This is portrayed through Candy's dog, and also through the fact that Candy has had his hand chopped off in a farming accident. Steinbeck seems to be suggesting that there is no happy old age, you just get older and more useless, and society disposes of you exactly as society has disposed of Candy's dog. So Candy's dog becomes a symbol for Candy himself, who is a symbol for how the old are treated in American society. Now, the other point he's making is about people's savings in the Great Depression. And he's pointing out that however much you've saved is probably not going to be enough to help you. And this is a very, very difficult message for old people. You can imagine they've saved all their lives, but suddenly they find their savings are worthless. And that reflects society at the time. And then finally, as we saw earlier with the law that would take the jobs of old people away, Steinbeck is showing how society will pretend to help you if you're old, but actually it will make things worse. So he's campaigning here for more equal rights for older workers. However, society is not listening to that message. Next, we have the idea of mental disability, and this is obviously symbolised through the character of Lenny. This historical background information comes from sciencehowstuffworks.com, and it features Dr. Monitz, who is the inventor of lobotomy. And in a lobotomy, doctors open up your brain and remove part of it in order to stop you behaving or feeling in a certain way. So Monitz concluded that he could perform a slightly different operation on people to separate their emotions and thoughts while retaining their intelligence. And so his lobotomized patients were serene and no longer anxious. Now we can see an exact parallel in Lenny here. George calming Lenny at the end, making him serene and peaceful, no longer worried. Do you remember Lenny asks, "Aren't you going to give me hell, George?" And George says, "No, I've never been angry with you." This is exactly the kind of approach of the medical profession that would accept it was okay to chop part of your brain and therefore your personality out. And obviously these doctors claimed that it didn't have an effect on your intelligence, but it did. So we can see Lenny, remember this is 1935, as a sort of walking embodiment of the lobotomy. This idea that you can actually tamper with people's brains physically like this, removing part of it, and still think that you're helping them. You could argue that this is exactly what George thinks when he kills Lenny. He justifies it to himself by saying, well, it's better than living life locked up as a lunatic. Well, yes, that might be true, but then again, it might not. You know, who is George to decide that? This is a really difficult position. Now, most readers decide in the end that Lenny was right to do so, but you don't have to. You can look at this kind of historical evidence that's going on at the time and think, well, Steinbeck's playing with this idea about how we should actually treat mentally ill people. Are we really saying that the best way to treat them is, in fact, to kill them once they become dangerous? It's a debate, and one that you could have in your essays. The important thing about Lenny is that he has the mind of a 5-year-old child, say, and Steinbeck uses this to explore the idea of innocence and also the idea of emotions. And through Lenny, he shows that the emotions will dominate and ruin reason. So Lenny doesn't have the ability to think things through properly. He simply reacts on his emotions. That's why he kills Lenny's wife. Curly's wife, because he's got this emotional reaction to the noise that she's making, and he leaps to a conclusion that if she makes a noise, he won't be able to tend the rabbits. But what he fails to notice is that if he shuts her up, he's so strong he's going to kill her. He doesn't use reason. The fact that he's managed to kill the mouse and the puppy ought to suggest to him that his strength is much greater than he can control. But that's a reasoned argument, which his, if you like, 5-year-old brain can't understand. And the other thing that Steinbeck uses Lenny for is to show that society won't make any allowances for mental illness. Everybody thinks Lenny is cuckoo, except for Slim. But Slim, you'll notice, is the one who tells George he was right to kill him. And that represents how society doesn't look after the mentally ill. In fact, they just get rid of them. Next, we have a theme which perhaps you haven't considered in your study of the novel, and that's the theme of Christianity. The whole premise of Christianity is that if you believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and you believe that he was resurrected, brought back to life after he was killed, in order to take on our sins, then simply by believing that, your soul has the opportunity to go to heaven. Well, Steinbeck plays with this idea in the novel. So this comes from the Steinbeck Institute, and we get some biographical detail about a 19-year-old John Steinbeck going to visit his mother's church. And he listens to the preacher and doesn't like what he hears. He yells out to the preacher in the church service, "Yes, you all look satisfied here, while outside the world begs for a crust of bread or a chance to earn it." So the first thing we can notice here is that Steinbeck is a campaigner for justice. Even as a 19-year-old youth, he still believes in social change and justice for the poor. And that, if you like, is one of the themes of the book. However, it's also an attack against the church and perhaps against God. We don't know whether Steinbeck had Christian beliefs. This writer decides that he has spiritual beliefs, therefore still believes in a kind of religious presence, but equally you could argue when you read the book that Steinbeck is anti-Christian and that he doesn't believe in God at all. It's up to you which way you choose to interpret the ending. Anyway, John has replied to the preacher with quiet wrath, wrath being anger. "I don't think much of preaching. Go on, you're getting paid for it." And this is an interesting way to look at the novel. Steinbeck gets his message across, but he doesn't spell it out to us. He doesn't preach. He simply tells us a story which invites us to come to his point of view about these sorts of discrimination. And he wants us to feel that we should stop it, and we feel that we should stop it because of the quality of the story. Okay, well, what has this got to do with Christianity? Well, Crooks argues that there is no heaven. This is just a fantasy, much like the Dream Ranch, and the fact that none of the characters get the Dream Ranch also suggests that heaven is not attainable. So Steinbeck could be suggesting as well that there is no heaven. We've also got the timescale of the book. So Jesus is put on the cross on Good Friday, then he's buried on the Saturday, and he rises again on Sunday, the Ascension Sunday. And that's why Easter always takes place on a weekend, Good Friday to the Sunday. Now, Steinbeck uses exactly the same time frame. They arrive and sleep in the brush on Friday, they work on Saturday, and then Lenny is killed on Sunday. But you'll notice that this is an inversion of the idea of resurrection and ascension, this going up to heaven idea, because Lenny is killed. He is alive and saved on the Friday. So by flipping the ascension story, the Easter story, on its head like this, Steinbeck could be suggesting that Christianity is not real, it's an illusion. If, however, you want to argue that this is a Christian novel, then you're going to suggest that this inversion happens because Steinbeck wants to show that man has turned his back on God. God's still there, it's just that man's not listening. Man is doing the opposite of what God has asked him to do and what Jesus has asked him to do. Then we've got this idea of Lenny going to heaven at the end. If you want a Christian view of the novel, you see George's instruction to Lenny to picture the ranch across the water while he shoots Lenny in the head as an image of the heaven that Lenny is going to go to. And if you want to see this as an anti-Christian novel, you'll look at that image of heaven as just an illusion, and that's the best that George can give in, an illusion of heaven just as he shoots him. You will also notice, I hope, that the novel is full of reference to Christ and hell, and so the characters are always cursing, Jesus Christ, give me hell, what the hell do you think? And this language, I think, is deliberate. Steinbeck is suggesting that there is a battle between good and evil, and it's up to you to decide which one you think wins by the end of the novel. We also have this consideration of the soul. So if George is a Christian, he has sacrificed his soul to save Lenny. So by killing Lenny and saving him from a painful death, he sacrifices his own soul because he's murdered Lenny, even if it's for a good reason. So George's soul would go to hell if you see it as a Christian novel. However, he walks off with Slim up to the highway, and Steinbeck deliberately chooses this idea because of its Christian association with moving to higher ground spiritually, getting closer to heaven. So you can interpret the novel as George actually being saved through this action, but you can't have him being saved in the religious sense, because if we are in a religious universe and it is ruled by a god, he can't justify George going to heaven because he's actually killed Lenny. And then this brings us to the idea of original sin. This idea comes from the Bible. It looks at the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, and it says that when Adam and Eve were tempted to eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, this was the original, the first sin, and everyone else who's descended from Adam and Eve carries that sin with them. In other words, we're not all born good, we're all born with this bit of sin in us. And you can easily see all the characters in this novel as sinful. They all commit evil acts, even if they do it for good reasons. So even Slim himself, out of kindness, decides to drown several of the puppies, but actually he's murdering them just to make life easier. Similarly, he thinks it's right for George to kill Lenny, but it's still murder. So even characters who are behaving in ways that they think are good are still capable of great evil. And then finally we have the theme of loneliness and isolation. And Steinbeck is suggesting that perhaps human beings are naturally isolated from each other, but that in times of poverty, like the Great Depression, this becomes much worse. Consequently, he sets his story in Soledad, which is Spanish for alone or loneliness. Interestingly, this is a real place. It really does exist in California, and you can Google Earth it and play around with trying to find the Gabilan Mountains and the actual part of the river where it takes place. So he chooses that name in the first line of the book to point out that his whole novel is symbolic about loneliness. Curly's wife is isolated and lonely and seeks the companionship of men, but that's ultimately what kills her. So she is destined always to be lonely. Even the people she's after for attention won't give it to her. Candy's loneliness can only be escaped if he gets hold of this dream ranch with Lenny and George, but he doesn't, and so he remains lonely. Similarly, Crooks, he has his only hope of escape, either to be with other black people, but he points out to us specifically that he is the only black person in the county now. The other families have moved away, and the whites don't want anything to do with him. He wants to join the ranch, but he withdraws from this once Curly's wife shows how white people can change their attitudes in a heartbeat, and he's faced with the possibility of being lynched. He also shows that black men are excluded by white society. You'll notice that George, for example, never comes into Crooks's room, even when he comes to fetch Lenny, because George is also racist. And George, if you like, is the hero of our novel. He's the one we're supposed to identify with, and perhaps the one who's most like some of the readers of the book. And Steinbeck deliberately makes him a racist because he knows that many of his readers will be. And much of the loneliness is caused by the violence of men towards each other, which is illustrated with Crooks, because you'll remember at Christmas time, last Christmas, he was made to fight for the entertainment of the other men. He didn't have any choice about this. He was lucky that he won the fight, but he's still forced to participate in this violence. And then George, ultimately his loneliness happens even when he's with Lenny. So he appears to have companionship with him, but as we see when he loses his temper with the crazy bastard, as he calls him, this isn't really a satisfying companionship. That's why he rejects the Dream Ranch at the end, because it was only to satisfy the companionship of Lenny. Another reading of the end, of course, is that when he goes off with Slim, George has ultimately found companionship. So you can read that ending in a slightly more optimistic way and decide that George will find companionship with Slim now. Although, to do that, you then become suspicious of George and think, well, did this make it much easier for him to get rid of Lenny? And this gives us some doubts about George's intentions, and we feel more ambivalent about him. And if I bring that back to loneliness, that adds to it. So he might expect us, if he were able to speak to us from the novel, to sympathise with him, but we can get to the end and exclude him a little from our approval, and therefore that isolates him still further. So there you have it, a complete analysis of all the themes of Mice and Men. Good luck with your revision, and subscribe if you'd like some more.